Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Coming up, we begin to celebrate what is known as Father's Day, where we look to the fathers that stood as patriarchs to be sure that we have the strength, the confidence, and the security that we wanted to feel that only a father could give us. But it seems this day and age, the definition of man and what his role in society is has been certainly skewered in ways that there may be confusion. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is an award-winning journalist, workshop leader, and inspirational speaker. He's also author in the fields of mind-body medicine, organic farming, and eco-spirituality. His new book is Redefining Manhood. It's a guide for men and those who love them. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Jim Pathfinder Ewing. Jim, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you, Daniel. It's good to be here.
You know, the last time I really had a discussion about manhood, I believe it was on a book called Betrayed, and it was right around 1999, produced by Susan Faludi. Is that a book that you're familiar with?
Not particularly that one.
Okay. Well, it was a giant man-sized book, as she liked to call it. It was actually doing sort of the same thing, like, what is the male identity this day and age? And it seems that entertainment, news, and magazines are all sort of taking a stab at redefining what we're supposed to be, and even more recently, you take a look at, well, of course, the transformation of one Bruce Jenner, and it probably leaves a lot of boys and young men scratching their heads going, well, what is our way here in this world?
That's true, and that's really the genesis of this book. I was asked about 3 years ago to do some workshops for men. There was a place here in Mississippi in Starkville, Mississippi Modern Homestead Center, where they were very successful in having women's retreats. And I've been doing workshops, I guess, for about 20 years. And so they asked me if I would consider doing one on men. And I said, well, I don't know. I have to look into it. So I kind of looked into it, and I had to tell them no. And they said, why? And I said, well, if you look at the literature on the subject, most of the books and workshops and so forth, they mostly revolve around the Iron John idea or patterns of manhood, which I don't think are valid anymore. And so we talked about it some more, and they kept after me. And finally, a little over a year ago, I kept telling them no, and because there weren't any books that I thought were valid. And the lady who heads the center said, well, what am I going to tell my sons? How do I teach them? And I thought about it, and I said, well, you're right. And she said, I guess you're going to have to write one. I said, I guess you're right. So that's what I did. And what I did was I looked at, of course, I read most of the books that involve men's retreats and so forth, and the ideas that they look at. But what struck me the most was that how male-female roles have changed so much over the last 20 years. And there's a good bit of research in the book, facts and figures and so forth about how society has changed, our culture has changed, and ways in which that women have evolved their attitudes and behaviors and beliefs a tremendous amount in the last 20 years. And I cite the sociological studies that show it on specific issues and how men's attitudes and behaviors and beliefs have not changed so much. They're lagging. And so what's happened is that you have a disconnect between men and women over what they believe, who they are and how they are and what they should be. Mm-hmm. And rather than tell anyone, you should be this way or you should be that way, what I did was I devised a series of exercises in the book where people can look at their own belief systems, who important people were in their lives, what they meant to them, and determine what their beliefs are. And then once they bring it out into the open, they can decide if those behaviors and beliefs are still valid.
It's interesting. I remember years ago I was interviewing with an author who she liked to write Westerns, which wasn't something that you usually hear about. And one of the things that she was doing is she was writing these Western stories from the perspective of the women who actually lived in the West. And I thought to myself, it's quite interesting when you think about the Old West, the Wild West, and you think about, how hardy and strong these men had to be as pioneers as they crossed the Great Divide and tried to settle into the new land. And you realize, well, wait a minute, as tough as it was for those guys, the women had it pretty rough too, so there was a real balance in some ways.
Absolutely, that's a valid point. We actually, in our society, don't recognize the achievements of women as much as we should, and actually, I go into a good bit in the book about how society evolved basically from the Roman model of patriarchy, and that if you go to before the Roman era, you find matrilineal and matrifocal systems, much the same as you have in Native American society here in America prior to the European intrusion. So when you look at it from that standpoint, you see that what we've had is the pendulum has swung too far over toward a male-dominated society. But you could say that perhaps it was too far over the other way 5,000, 6,000 years ago, but perhaps now we can find a middle ground.
Now, I know, as you take a look at, for instance, the world of television, that certainly has been one of those that, I don't know, at times, if you look over the decades, seem confused about what the male role is supposed to be. Should he be strong and rigid and, set in his ways as he guides the family in a direction that is best for everybody? Or is he one that becomes more flexible, compassionate, and yielding? And it seems that it's like a one-way or the other situation, and it's been going that way for quite a long time, and I can see where the confusion of that would be versus, let's say that the male is strong but yet compassionate and yielding, instead of just one way or the other. That's sort of how you viewed it, because it seems that way in the book that as you talk about those sort of things.
Right, exactly. In the book, I give the archetypes which are common to most of our society today, including like the lone Western Lone Ranger type, and the detective novels where the guy and his gun are loners and so forth, and also contrast different ways in which men have other archetypes. For example, people keep asking me what would be an archetype for a new man of this time period, and one that I give in the book, and of course I'm not saying this is an archetype because I think that we're developing archetypes. We don't have a new man archetype at present. In my book, what I hope for is to go back to what you might say verities or long-standing qualities of men, but which are positive, which we can all agree on. But one that I give is two presidents, and at the risk of going into politics, I'd say that George W. Bush was one, and Barack Obama was the other, and that you have one man, George W. Bush, who rebelled against his father and called himself a war president, and then you have another who lived with his mother and had a more nuanced, you might say, view of the world, in which he's trying to adapt, in which archetypes are confusing to him or not as clear-cut as they would be in another social type parenting situation. So actually what we find, our society is actually closer to the Obama model now than it is with the George W. Bush model, which you might say was a 1950s and 60s type archetype. And so if you look at those, you look around you and you look at the relationships that we have today, you see that our leaders actually, in a way, reflect different ideas and concepts that are in the mix today.
Now, you take a look at, here's one that's really fascinating, and you write about, and it left me kind of scratching my head and thinking about it quite a bit, because you really see the imbalance in the world of business at times. Capitalism. First of all, you have people like, say, for instance, the Wolf of Wall Street, and if you remember the corporate raiders of the 1980s, early 1990s, and it was all really not so much about business and building and developing good business relations, but it was more about, the hunt for the kill. It seems we turned business into the hunt. And then all of a sudden there was the rise of the corporate women. And, and it seemed to be so interesting in its political structure as it was approached and talked about, that you weren't certain, what was the right thing to do outside of good business.
Right. Well, one of the themes in the book I show is that there's a tremendous drive in Western society toward egalitarianism. And, of course, everything has a yin and yang. You have a positive and negative side to everything. And whether something is positive or negative, of course, depends upon your point of view. But as far as the rise of egalitarianism in business, I go in there in the book, I outline these broad measures that over the last 300, 400 years have been drivers of Western society, one of which is capitalism, and which actually has a very positive egalitarian side to it, in that when you look at the hidden hand of Adam Smith and so forth, you say, well, this is not moral, but it's not immoral, it's amoral, in that if you take that profit and money defines worth, then you see that it's not necessarily a patriarchy which drives it, but what is the merit that brings the money. So if you look in this standpoint, you see that today more women are graduating from college than men, and that there are now, as a rate, more women who are middle managers than men because of this greater educational balance. And you see that trend is developing, that what inevitably will happen is that worth and value on a purely economic system will lead toward egalitarianism. You say, well, how can that be if we see that male CEOs make much more than female? But if you look at the numbers and the types of jobs that women are getting now, as far as CEO and director jobs and so forth, you see that the tide is changing. So it's not a question of where we are at the moment as far as achievement, but where the trends are they're going. And this is causing a lot of consternation among men, because the rising tide, for example, in the tech industry, as a good example, would be where you see that so many males, there's a paucity of females entering tech and STEM studies and so forth. But what you're finding also that there's a greater emphasis upon women to enter those fields, and that women are actually becoming highly placed as far as CEOs, CFOs, and so forth. And so that trend is going to continue in that level as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, taking a look, too, sometimes men can feel threatened about the idea of a woman coming into an arena that was typically for men, because it was an arena, for instance, working in the fire department, that it takes strength and endurance to be able to carry out the duties of a firefighter. Then you look at the United States military. There was a time I actually served in the United States Navy back in the 1980s, and just some years back, I ended up coming across a documentary called Carrier, and this was about the USS Nimitz, an aircraft carrier which is considered to be the most powerful military weapon on planet Earth. And what was amazing to see that was the fact that it was such a co-ed ship, that there were men and women on a warship. In my time, women weren't even allowed to be on ships that had any kind of weaponry whatsoever. And I was just amazed at the transformation and thought, what took America so long to get it together? And then you take a look at, for instance, the advent of a movie like G.I. Jane, starring Demi Moore, in which she actually goes into the Navy SEALs. And the whole idea and the argument seems to always be, well, if she can do the job, equal to a man, then she gets it. It's that simple. But then you start hearing how there are some adjustments to the, training and the testing and so forth, so that way it seems equal. Even on the golf course, the women's tees are set usually 5 to 10 yards ahead of the males, so it's a shorter distance. And you kind of wonder, okay, well, maybe that's a physical capacity of theirs, but in translation for the male, tries to figure out, well, how can I kind of have my ground and enjoy being male? Why do I have to be seemingly in competition for something like that?
One of the issues that I think is important in this debate when we talk about males and females is that there is no one male way and one female way, in that you have numbers. When you look at aggregate numbers, you see that men are generally bigger and stronger and so forth, or have been throughout history, and women have been more diminutive. But if you look at individuals, then you see that there are certainly a lot of men who are not big, brawny guys, and there are a lot of women who are extremely athletic and can best probably, well, who knows? If you look, for example, in sports, in high-level sports, a woman, a tennis pro, female can beat probably most of the men she would ever meet. So they don't. It's not that there are women are segregated on this way and men are segregated on another way. As far as all measures, it's how individuals are measured.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that when you look at individuals and when you look at how these are social and cultural definitions on how people are segregated according to race and gender and attitudes and beliefs, then you see that there's actually a big middle area that where women, some women have higher aptitudes for one thing or another, and some men have higher aptitudes for another. So what's happening is that our ideas have been sociologically and culturally defined, and what's happening is that these divisions are crumbling. They're crumbling in fact. So even if you have attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that are residues of the way things were perceived in the past, they're not being followed that way. Culturally and socially, we're changing. And so what we've got to do is change our belief systems or get rid of that lag between the way we have been socially and culturally taught to a more representative way in which our society is actually changing and the way people are actually performing. Mm-hmm. That's what's happening. So it's a question of, do we want to continue to hold old ideas, for example, even the one that in the military, where brawn is the issue, brawn or sensitivity or whatnot, which is an idea that in the past, when brawn and being inured to bloodshed was something that was prized in warfare, even going back to men in armor, to a situation now where other skills are actually more in demand in the military. Those that require judgment, those that find motor skills, decision-making ability, things that aren't necessarily male or aren't that much different between male and female, and at least it's not when in the military today, where you have aptitudes that are very carefully measured. Mm-hmm. When you have aptitudes that are carefully measured and tailored to these highly structured, highly specialized jobs, then the idea of G.I. Joe really is just, he's still going to be a grunt. He's not going to be a general. See what I'm saying?
As a matter of fact, I'm glad you brought that up as far as aptitude goes, because going back to the documentary Carrier that I was talking about, there are actually two women they show there that are actually fighter pilots. And one of them is a fairly large, red-headed woman who seems very masculine. She's pretty good at sports. She'll probably whoop you pretty good in a basketball or football game. She's physically, a pretty strong person. And here she's a fighter pilot. Well, then on the other hand, there's another female fighter pilot who kind of seems very womanly, feminine, very light-spoken in voice. And you realize she's not the same physical specimen, but yet both of them are getting behind the wheel of an F-14 fighter jet capable of doing the same amount of damage. And so when you talk about aptitude, there's an example of what you're talking about there, and those are just two women, so.
Right. Well, if you look at popular culture, you can see, too, like even in Top Gun, Tom Cruise was a hotshot, reckless, and would you entrust him with a $100 million machine? No, I wouldn't. But the guy who was his co-pilot, Goose, who, he was a sensitive, thoughtful, caring individual.
Right.
And his loss, of course, his was the message that came through, that without people like Goose, then you can't have effective fighters.
Well, that and allegedly probably having a family to be responsible to was another thought, too. Not be reckless, but think of others as well.
Right.
And
those are qualities that are more considered matrifocal than they are patriarchal.
Mm-hmm.
We like to say that this book also grew out of a previous book, the one that I wrote immediately before, which was called Conscious Food, Sustainable Growing, Spiritual Eating, which what I found in researching that was, if you look at the historical record, you see that today you think of farmers as being males, because it's male oriented. You think of farmer, you think of a man, then you think of a farm wife maybe, but at least as far as popular culture. But in fact, today, what is you might call the food movement and so forth is predominantly women, and it's health oriented, and it is socially oriented. It has all those qualities which are of this previous time, in which you have a more thoughtful, sensitive, inclusive way of looking at food systems, which includes everyone. And that way of looking at things is actually the very root of agriculture. If you look at the historical record, you see that women invented agriculture. It was because of living in one area where women tended the crops. And it's through actually the use of food as warfare in ancient times in Egypt and other places that men took over the food systems as a way of controlling population and controlling government. And that right there is the shift between the matrilineal societies that occurred prior to during the Paleolithic era when this happened, and the time when male patriarchy, government, warfare, and so forth, the creation of artificial scarcity and lack to control populations came into play. And so that book, Conscious Food, is what really shifted my thinking, or at least gave me the insight of what was going on today. Mm-hmm. That if you look at what's happening today, not only just in male-female relationships, but also in the way our culture has developed from these prehistoric times to today, you see that it could be said that patriarchy is actually an experiment that has failed, and it's failing all around us all the time. Just a lot of people don't know it yet.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing to really point out, I've talked about this on the program over and over again when we have a discussion such as this, is I liken to go back to indigenous cultures, Native American Indians, South Americans when it comes to Incas, Aztecs, and the like, is you're taking a look at a very balanced society. In other words, male and females had equal roles in deciding what the community and the direction of the community was, and it was a discussion. Sure, you had warriors of the warrior class, but they were only there sort of as a last resort in case there had to be war or battle. It wasn't, that they were there first and we follow them. And you kind of take a look at how that kind of really changed, especially after the great wars that we've had, where it seems war first, then we'll worry about democracy later, when in fact it used to be the reverse of that.
Exactly, and I mentioned that in my book as well. If you look at Native American society, at least as far as the settled ones on the eastern seaboard, you see that the structure was matrilineal and matrifocal. And the example I give in my book is of Iroquois society, where sometimes these discussions would go on for days about, for example, where to go to war. The clans, which was the definition of family, which was the power of the group, because the women owned all the property. The men did not. If you married, then you were married into the clan of the mother, and divorce in that society was that if the woman decided they didn't want you, she would put your moccasins outside the door and you were out. You'd have to go to the men's hut. So in that society, all the food and all the property and the children we're all under the female. And here in Mississippi, where I live, down here with the Choctaw and up in Tennessee and Alabama, North Georgia, and Cherokee, a lot of settlers had a hard time understanding that the women had power. When they would find out that if they married a native woman, they found out that they were expected to do her bidding, that she was the one with the power and the property and so forth, and that of course was a big culture clash. But in those societies, you have a good example is the medicine wheel, which is a circle with a cross between it, and that is a symbol of balance, where you have the cross is division, and that is generally considered a male symbol, where you have action and movement and change, and you have the circle, which bounds it, which is the circle of all your relations, which is the mother and the father and the children and the grandchildren and all the spiritual aspects of being in balance on this earth, which the circle also represents. So you have these two separate ideas, which are a yin and yang of male and female, and when they're in balance, then everything is wonderful. It's just the same way as nature. When everything is in balance, then everything goes well. But when things are out of balance, then you try to bring them in balance. And the way that native societies did it was that they had what's called a war chief and a peace chief. And during times of peace, you had the peace chief. And the peace chief could be a woman, doesn't have to be a man. And it was the person who governed, who made all the decisions that had to be made during times of peace. And then when you had war, then you had a war chief. And that was someone who was selected by the group. But it wasn't just the group, it was the clan mothers. The clan mothers are the ones who had all the power. They would be like what the Senate is in our way of doing things. They were the ones who were supposed to be more deliberate and so forth. And so they would choose who among them would make the best war chief, and because of temperament and family and so forth. And so those decisions were actually made by women. And the decisions also were made by the whole tribe. And this also extended into Western tribes, too, where you had a group where the group would come together and discuss something for days on end, and until they came to a decision in which everyone had their say. And then when they made that decision, then that's what it was. That's what the decision was. And that's why, for example, in the Iroquois, I give the example that they were considered the fiercest of fighters, because they naturally did not want war. They wanted peace, because that was where culture flourished and where children flourished, where you could take care of the grandparents and everyone. It was inclusive. But if war came about, if war was necessary, then the entire tribe would speak, from the youngest to the eldest, until this was decided, or someone would speak for them to represent them. And then when that decision was made, it was made by the entire tribe. So it was a life and death decision. War wasn't decided by a few who wanted to go to war. It was decided by the entire culture. Mm-hmm. And that's why they were considered such fierce fighters, because it wasn't a question of going to war for a little while or a couple of years or something like that. This was the very life and death of the tribe, and every member of the tribe was part of it. So that's a big difference from what we have today.
Mm-hmm. Now, you share an interesting story that actually relates to you in the book, and it was a time in your childhood with your father. And it started getting me thinking as I was reading that about, for instance, the Chinese culture, and how they say that a father tends to, unless they work on this and come to terms with their fears, will tend to pass those on to their sons. And I found that interesting in thinking about that while I was reading what I was reading in there, because the whole idea is the father has the opportunity in his generation to transform those fears to where they become more of an asset to pass on to their son, to build strength into their son. In other words, defining a manhood. What is strength, for instance? You'll hear, crying, where it's seen by others, can be considered weakness, and men aren't weak. When in fact the father could say, no, crying and showing emotion and feeling emotion is a very strong attribute. And in the case where you were sharing your story about your father, you had realized that it really wasn't him who had actually hit you, but it was actually the father before him and the father before him. So you get to see how I was seeing sort of the Chinese perception of passing on the fears and not coming to terms with that. You know, for instance, myself as a father, I never knew who my real father was. I mean, I knew him, but I never met him, never came to know what his thoughts were, how he would act or react to things. So it kind of left me sort of out there wondering, well, what do I do? So I knew to define that if I had children, they would at least know who I was, what I thought, what I felt, you know, that I was available at least. Because I didn't really have that sort of way, you know, that I could know what that was. Do you understand what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I understand what you're talking about exactly. And it was, of course, it was the event that you speak of where he hit me, and I realized that was, you know, later on that was not really him who was hitting me so much as his father and his father and his father. Mm-hmm. And these are issues you find more and more that a lot of who we are and what we do is based on these echoes of people who have lived in our paths before, lived in our, and I can get metaphysical and say that it goes even in past lives, but we'll stick to where we are here in this Earth School. We say that that it wasn't him; it was his father and his father, and I realize that now. I totally realize that, and it was a pattern that I had to break, you know, in order to have a son. Mm-hmm. Because I vowed I would never do that to my son. I would never do it. But I had to come to grips with it and understand it, and I had to recognize the impulse in myself as well. And so that's why I put in there these exercises, and one of which is, I think, the most important one is recapitulation, which is a shamanic way of redefining yourself. And it's actually a very powerful tool that, you know, shamans have used for thousands of years. But in simplified fashion, what it is allows you to grow. It allows you to think, in a simplified version, you would take that example of perhaps my father striking me and then write down all that you remember about the memory, and then also writing down other things that involve who this person is so that you can look at it objectively. And what I saw in this example and in recapitulation this way was that, my father, when he did this, was the same age as I was when I had my son. So what I saw from a vantage of years later was that, golly, he really didn't know much, because I didn't really know much at that age. And so what he was doing, I looked at his father and saw that his father was basically in the same boat. And so you're passing down young men struggling to be fathers and not knowing what to do except for as they had been treated by their own fathers. And so when you look at it from an objective standpoint like that, when you write it down and look at it and you say, aha, this is one of those aha moments,
right,
where what you're doing is you're transforming that experience from the eyes of a child of hurt and pain and misunderstanding to one of being an adult and seeing, hey, this guy is me, and this guy is me when I was that age, and doing all the same things that he was doing, and I would not want to do this, and so you forgive him and forgive yourself, and in that way you become a greater, larger, more understanding and more compassionate person. And these are when you do recapitulation of this type, you look at it in this way and change yourself and change your perceptions, then you can share them with other people, and you're actually changing everyone around you.
Mm-hmm. Now, on the program over the last few years, I have certainly had my share of conversations with women from a metaphysical, spiritual standpoint, talking about the rise of the feminine power. And I wonder sometimes if the listening audience, and I'm not saying they're unintelligent, very intelligent audience, wonders, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that it's going to become more dominant over the masculine? And the real thought is, no, what you're seeing is a rise that comes back to balance. Is that pretty much what you see?
Absolutely,
okay.
Yes. And that's, we have, I think that in the book I give a pretty good example of I'm not a psychologist, but I give some of the ideas about the dark mother and so forth on how wounds are, are transmitted through years and generations and so forth, from father to son and mother to son as well, and how even this was recognized even by Virginia Woolf, which I thought was kind of interesting, where she saw that actually more mothering, when you shove all that, all the parenting onto the mother, that actually makes for a more embittered and unhappy child who then grows into, who can become a very terrible male toward women. So, but these are issues that when you see that there is a lack of balance as there is in our society, and there's a constant push, at least in our society, to try to push, or has been, to push women into these roles, that what happens is you have unintended consequences. Things are, if they're unbalanced on one side, then they'll be unbalanced on the other side. And so that's exactly what you're talking about, is the rise of women's power and female empowerment is not one that is it's not one that women are over men or men are over women. What it is bringing the power up so that people can share more equally, so that both people are empowered. Because if you do diminish one and one over another, then you're not adding to anyone's power. What you're doing is you're creating disequilibrium in both that yo-yos back and forth through the generations.
Mm-hmm. It's such a fascinating subject to talk about because, it leaves people with so many questions at times, and wondering what is the right direction to go. And really the bottom line is just be who you are, the expression of who you are, and enjoy it for that measure, and quit worrying about comparing yourself with everybody else.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things in the book I give is Native America, how most tribes call themselves human beings. And there's a reason for that, is because it's self-defining. That is, that people define themselves, the qualities of being a human being, which is being thoughtful and compassionate and strong and wise and giving and so forth. All these complete circle of attributes that we consider to be a true human being, someone who has compassion for others but is strong when need be, and who can be a leader to lead others, but also a good follower who can support those who have good ideas. All these things are considered to be a good human being. And so when you look at it from that point, when you define yourself as rather than male or female, saying, well, I'm going to be a masculine male, and I'm going to be G.I. Joe, and I'm going to be the Lone Ranger, and I'm going to be the king, and I'm going to be the warrior, and I'm going to be this and that and the other, as opposed to other things, then you're actually getting yourself a little bit out of whack over who you truly are. Those are things that you can self-identify to affect behavior and affect will over others. But as far as who you really are, who you really are, not the person who's been told what to be, not the person who hears these things, I shouldn't do that because all these people said you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, but the person who is the one who's the decider, the one who makes you who you are. In other words, not the one the one who listens, the one who hears yourself, the silence of your soul, the inner wisdom of your soul, and behaves in a way which is exactly what you're saying, who you truly are, as a human being. Then you become whole and complete, and you become more able to decide how you should go and how you should respond to things.
Very well put. I know that people will really enjoy this book. Redefining Manhood is the book. Our guest today, Jim Pathfinder Ewing. Jim, for our listeners, is there a website people can go and find out more about this?
Yeah, blueskywaters.com.
blueskywaters.com. Well, thank you so much for being on the program today. Always a pleasure to talk about stuff like this. In fact, I kind of want to wrap it up a little bit in a way that could seem to be, well, I'm just going to do it anyway. This day and age, as I mentioned earlier in the program, we have Bruce Jenner, transgender, changing into a woman. What are your thoughts, not necessarily on that, because there's the courageous side, because there are those who, wow, there is somebody who's up there, who's powerful, who's putting it all out there, but I sometimes wonder if that might even cause some confusion in young boys, because, here was a man who won the decathlon. He was probably one of the most celebrated athletes, especially during the 70s, in Olympic history, really. And then all of a sudden this happens, and you think, that's great that we see the courage probably for that group of people, human beings, but what about how, the ripple effects that maybe we don't think about?
Well, that's a good point, and it's one that I actually put on my Facebook page. If you look under Facebook, Jim Pathfinder Ewing, I posted a New York Times article in which women were responding to it, and I put on there that I thought it was a healthy discussion. And I do believe that's true. Of course, in that also got some comments. People were horrified because it runs the gamut. For a lot of people, it's a terrifying, frightening thing because their gender role or what they assume to be, who they are, is they're maybe a little bit frightened about it, or they're tender about it, or they're defensive about it. It creates a lot of emotion, which may or may not be really valid to the discussion. But you can look on there and read that New York Times article. I think it's really good. But I think that really when you look at, if you look at, take it from a purely spiritual point of view, if you look at who we're born to be, and this is beyond male and female, but if we're really spiritual beings in human bodies, then who we are is an expression of who we are on the inside, not who we are on the outside. And for some people, I think it's entirely true that people, for whatever reason, do not feel that they are on the outside who they are on the inside. And I think that if we recognize within each individual person, and this is, for example, in Namaste, that greeting, it says, the divinity within me greets the divinity within you. Or in Cherokee, the Nuwati, the spirit that's within everything, the good spirit within everything, that if we recognize the spirit of Creator within each one of us, and we are true to that within ourselves, then we can accept other people no matter how they are on the outside, because the outside is so many different variations of what they believe, what they think, who's them, who's not them, what other people think about them, what our culture thinks about them, that if we focus not on the exterior of who we are, but the interior of who we are, then I think the rest of it will settle itself out.
Well, and I think when you put it into that context, too, is that you finally allow someone to realize the goal, when we get this wonderful opportunity called life, is to really not only enjoy what life has for you as you experiment to discover what that is, but in the meantime, it's also just being a good human being.
Absolutely.
Isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I thought that would be kind of an interesting discussion to bring into something like this, because you can see how people might bring that in. Then it becomes, in my opinion, more of a politically correct discussion, and we already know how that is. Once it's political, then it's an opinion, and you never get anywhere.
Well, if you look at the narrative of his life, you see that if you look at it from the long view, his life has been a very interesting one in the limelight his entire life.
Right.
And, they call me a pathfinder for a reason. I was given that name. I think he's a pathfinder, that maybe before he was born in the Bardo and he had choices to make over what he was going to do in this earth school, he said, I want to provide a role model for people to look at themselves and see how they fit, how they truly fit in, and if they don't fit in, how they can make themselves understand who they truly are. Mm-hmm. If you look at it from a standpoint, if you look at people's lives, particularly when you have a long life, one that has many ins and outs and circles and curlicues and so forth, you can often sort of get an idea of where someone's, you might say, spiritual contract is, and where it's going right and maybe where it's going wrong. For example, I think there are some people who may have been born, say, with a spiritual bent, and then they went wrong. It became too far one way or too far another. Of course, that's just my opinion. But if you look at from the standpoint of what a person's lifetime and what they've achieved in broader terms, you can see that often people are living up to their spiritual contracts. Mm-hmm.
That's a very good way to put that as well. There's no doubt about that. Your website is blueskywaters.com. That's where you can find out more about Jim Pathfinder Ewing. And the book is Redefining Manhood. So the question is, how will you redefine yourself? Jim, thank you so much for joining us here on the program today. What a pleasure.
Well, thank you for having me.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there. You can discover more also by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. Also, sign up for our free weekly e-news updates. You can find out how to do that when you're there as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.